Get ready to uncover one of the most intense and mysterious moments in the Bible. You've probably heard of Samson, the man with supernatural strength who defeated entire armies with his bare hands. But what really happened in his final moments? What no one told you about Samson's ultimate sacrifice might completely change the way you see this story. Was it just an act of revenge? Or was there something much greater behind his decision? The answer may surprise you. Stay until the end, because we're going to reveal details that few people know. Shall we unravel this mystery together? Then let's dive into the video. In the ancient land of Israel, marked by battles and tensions, an extraordinary man walked among men, but with a strength that transcended the limits of human understanding. Samson was a man known for his superhuman strength, which seemed to come from an immeasurable divine power. His story, however, was not just about muscles and victories. It was a story of redemption, of failures, and above all, of a sacrifice that would forever change the trajectory of Israel. From the moment of his birth, Samson was marked by a unique destiny. His mother, previously barren, received a visit from an angel who promised her a son, chosen by God to deliver Israel from the cruel rule of the Philistines. He would be a Nazirite, consecrated to God from the womb, and his strength would be linked to a sacred covenant with the Lord. His hair, which should never be cut, would be the symbol of this covenant, and his strength would flow from this divine commitment. But Samson's life was anything but easy. Although he was gifted with unparalleled strength, this same strength made him impulsive and stubborn. He was not perfect, and his mistakes often pulled him away from the plan God had for him. His struggle was not just against the Philistines, but against his own nature, his impulsiveness, and his lack of control over his emotions. But above all, there was something more. The mission he carried was of great importance. He was not there simply to defeat enemies, but to be God's instrument in freeing a people suffering under the oppression and ruthless hands of the Philistines. However, Samson's final sacrifice, the one that marked the climax of his life, would not merely be a demonstration of his strength. It would be the key to his true redemption. Samson knew that his life was far from perfect, but he also knew that, in the end, he was a tool in God's hands. His sacrifice, so painful and humiliating in the eyes of men, would actually be the moment God used to bring the definitive victory over the Philistines and deliver Israel from the seemingly endless oppression. In that final scene, with his eyes gouged out, chained, and humiliated, Samson finally understood that his true strength did not lie in his muscles, but in his faith in God and his total surrender to Him. He would surrender like never before, so that the divine purpose could be fulfilled. And through his death, a miracle would happen. The destruction of the Philistines, who had been the greatest cause of suffering for Israel, and the restoration of freedom for God's people. Samson's strength, at that moment, would not come from his flesh, but from the very Spirit of God, who was with him until his last breath. Samson's final sacrifice would be proof that, even in human failures and weaknesses, God still has the power to turn evil into good and death into victory. For many years, the people of Israel lived under the oppressive weight of the Philistines. They, a warrior and relentless people, imposed an era of suffering and humiliation. The lands that once flourished with God's blessings were now covered in fear. The people of Israel, who had been led by leaders like Deborah and Gideon, who had brought them victory and rebirth, now found themselves in a state of despair, crushed by the brutality of the Philistines. The Philistines dominated the cities with an iron fist, collecting heavy tributes, imposing their pagan culture, and stripping Israel of its freedom. The Israelites, unable to effectively oppose them, saw their sons and daughters taken to serve their oppressors, and the temples of their gods destroyed, while the pagan gods dominated the region. All that remained for Israel was the silent cry of the people, who, although they had lost faith in themselves, never lost hope that one day they would be freed. The cause of this oppression was clear: Israel's unfaithfulness to God. The people turned away from the ways of the Lord, seeking the pleasures and false promises of the Philistines, and in return, God allowed the Philistines to dominate them. During this time of suffering, God's voice seemed absent, and many wondered if He still cared for His people. But even in the silence, the divine plan was being orchestrated. As the people of Israel suffered, in a distant corner of the nation, God began to devise a plan for their liberation. It would not come through a grand army or a glorious king. God would choose a man, simple, but with a grand divine purpose. The people didn't know it, but the beginning of their deliverance was about to start. In their despair, they could not see how the solution could arise, but God, in His perfect timing, would raise someone who would free them from this oppression with a strength only he could grant. Israel's deliverance would come from where they least expected. In a moment when Israel's hope seemed completely extinguished, God looked at the people and decided that liberation would not come from a massive army or a powerful king. He would choose an ordinary man, but with an extraordinary destiny, a man who would not rely on human wisdom or the strength of an army to carry out the divine work. Samson would be the chosen one. His mission would not be easy, nor free of suffering, but he was predestined to be God's instrument to free Israel. From birth, Samson's life would be marked by a divine promise. He would not be like the other Israelites, for he would have a sacred calling, different from any judge that had arisen before. God would not call him to lead an army or to govern with earthly wisdom. His strength, extraordinary and supernatural, would be the means by which he would carry out God's will. But more important than his strength would be his dependence on God to fulfill his mission. God's choice of Samson was a plan that transcended the limits of human understanding. While the Israelites cried out for a political or military leader, God chose a man whose strength would not come from his physical abilities, but from a deep spiritual bond. Samson's strength would be the evidence that God was still working in his people, and that, even in the darkest circumstances, he was in control. Samson would not be a leader like the others, but a judge chosen to fulfill a unique purpose. Unlike other leaders who arose to fight with swords and strategies, Samson would depend on a power that came directly from God. He was not being called to seek victories in his own glory or power, but to be the vehicle through which God would show his greatness to the world. However, despite this divine choice and the supernatural strength he would have, Samson would not be spared from personal failures and challenges. He would have to learn that true strength did not lie in his physical strength, but in faith and dependence on God. It was a plan that many would not understand. Why choose such an impulsive, flawed man? But divine wisdom always surpasses human understanding. And so, God began preparing Samson to fulfill his mission. He would be a judge, but a different kind of judge. His story would not be marked only by external victories, but by the internal struggle, the battle between his own will and God's will. And throughout his journey, he would have to learn that Israel's true deliverance would not come from his own hands, but from the hands of a God who would use even his flaws to fulfill his perfect plan. In the house of Manoah and his wife, there was an emptiness that only the joy of a child could fill. However, there was a silent pain that accompanied them. His wife was barren. The sadness of not having children was a heavy mark on their hearts, especially in a culture where lineage was crucial and the expectation of having children was great. But God, in his sovereignty, was about to do something incredible and unexpected for this family. He would open the womb of Manoah's wife. In a moment of deep distress and prayer, the angel of the Lord appeared before Manoah's wife. He revealed himself as a divine messenger and made a promise that would change the destiny of Israel. She would conceive a son. This would not be an ordinary child. God had chosen him from the womb for a sacred mission. He would be a Nazirite, wholly dedicated to God, and would be the deliverer of Israel, chosen to overthrow the oppression of the Philistines. The angel instructed the woman not to drink wine or fermented drinks, and to remain pure, for the child would be consecrated from the moment of his conception. The baby would be born with a divine purpose, and his life would be marked by supernatural strength that would come directly from God. The woman, still stunned and in disbelief, rushed to tell her husband about the encounter. Manoah, in his humility and fear of God, sought more clarity about this divine mission. In faith, he asked the Lord to send the angel again to explain how he and his wife should raise the child. The Lord, in his mercy, granted this request and sent the angel once more. The confirmation that God was truly in control of the situation became evident when the angel ascended to heaven in the midst of a flame before Manoah and his wife, leaving them amazed and, at the same time, terrified by the magnitude of what was about to happen. The birth of Samson, then, was not just the birth of a boy, but the fulfillment of a promise that would bring hope to all of Israel. It was a clear sign that God had not abandoned them, even in the midst of oppression and silence. He was working, even when it seemed that his people were forgotten. The miracle of Samson's birth, therefore, was not just a gift for Manoah and his wife, but for the entire nation of Israel, a promise that deliverance would come from where they least expected it, and that true strength would come from the hands of God himself. From the moment of his birth, Samson was consecrated to God. His life was marked by a sacred covenant, a commitment to the Lord that required exclusive dedication, with no compromises. As a Nazirite, Samson would be different from all other Israelites, for he would be set apart for God in a unique and special way. The rules of the Nazirite vow were clear and demanding, reflecting the high level of holiness required for one chosen for a divine mission. The first rule that Samson had to follow was abstinence from wine and any fermented drink. This was not just a matter of avoiding drunkenness. It was a sign of separation, a distancing from earthly indulgences and negative influences. For a Nazirite, control over the senses and the body was crucial to maintaining pure consecration. Wine, often associated with feasts and pagan celebration, was to be avoided at all costs. The second rule for Samson was to avoid touching anything unclean, including corpses. This had a deep significance, as a Nazirite was called to maintain purity not only spiritually, but physically as well. Death and what it represented, decay and destruction, were incompatible with the holy life to which Samson had been called. This rule demanded discipline and self-control, as even in combat or risk situations, he had to avoid any contact with the unclean, a manifestation of the divine desire for a life separate from the corruptions of the world. The third and final rule, perhaps the most emblematic, concerned his hair. Samson was never to cut his hair, and this feature would become a visible mark of his dedication to God. Samson's long hair was not just a style or appearance, but a clear sign of his covenant with the Lord. His strength, the supernatural strength that would enable him to defeat the Philistines and fulfill his purpose, came from this consecration, from his obedience to divine rules. His hair was the most visible symbol of his mission, of his direct connection to the power of God. These Nazirite rules were not simple restrictions. They represented a way of life completely devoted to the divine work. Every aspect of Samson's life, from what he ate to what he did, had to reflect his consecration and separation to God. The idea of holiness was imbued in every decision he made, and his physical strength was merely a reflection of the spiritual strength he could access through his obedience. Although Samson was extraordinary because of his physical strength, the secret of his power did not lie in his natural abilities, but in his unconditional dedication to God. Samson's strength came from his faithfulness to the rules the Lord had set for him, and his hair, untouched and growing endlessly, was a constant testimony of that relationship. These rules, which seemed so simple at first glance, were, in fact, the foundation of a mission that required not only physical strength, but also discipline and spiritual obedience. Manoah and his wife, though blessed with the promise of an extraordinary child, also bore the weight of an immense responsibility. The angel of the Lord not only revealed to them the birth of Samson, but gave them clear and specific instructions on how to raise their child so that he would fulfill the divine mission assigned to him. This responsibility extended not only to respecting the Nazirite vows, but also to raising him in an environment of faithfulness to God. They were not just parents of a boy, but guardians of a prophetic destiny, and the weight of this mission was upon their shoulders from the moment the promise was made. Manoah, although grateful for the divine blessing, could not help but feel uncertain. He knew he was dealing with something much greater than himself. The future of Israel was tied to the life of his son. Therefore, in a moment of humility and deep reverence, he prayed to God, asking that the angel return to further clarify the instructions that had been given. It was natural for him, as a father, to desire assurance that he was doing everything correctly, so that his son would not fail to fulfill the divine calling. God, in his infinite goodness, answered Manoah's request and sent the angel once more. When the angel appeared before Manoah and his wife, both were amazed and filled with reverence. The angel confirmed all the instructions that had already been given, but this time, he did something even more impressive. He ascended to heaven in a flame, a clear sign that his message was divinely authorized and that the Lord was, in fact, in control of everything. This supernatural act, which left them both awestruck and fearful, was a powerful reminder that Samson was not just a son, but a man chosen by God for a grand mission. Manoah and his wife, now more confident in the importance of their task, understood that they needed to raise Samson with great care, always remembering that he did not belong only to them, but to God. Every step of his education, every decision, should reflect their commitment to divine instructions, so that he would grow in wisdom and strength, empowered to fulfill the purpose for which he had been called. The faithfulness of Samson's parents was crucial for the fulfillment of the divine mission. They were not just instruments of his birth, but also pillars of his spiritual and moral formation. Although at times the task seemed arduous and insecurities weighed upon them, the certainty that they were cooperating with God's plan gave them strength and direction. They knew that Samson would be great, but that greatness would not come without challenges. Still, they trusted in the Lord, aware that faithfulness in following his instructions was the key to the success of his mission and the liberation of Israel. Samson's journey was just beginning, and his parents, as faithful guides, would play a vital role in preparing him to face the challenges ahead. Manoah and his wife's obedience to God would not only prepare Samson for his great mission, but also serve as an example of faith and commitment, showing that when one follows divine plans, great things can happen. As Samson grew, it became clear that he was no ordinary young man. His strength was unmatched, something others had never seen before. From childhood, he showed signs of extraordinary vigor, but his strength did not come from his physical body. It was the Spirit of the Lord that empowered him, enabling him to perform feats that seemed impossible for any man. He did not just display physical power, but a presence that reminded everyone that he was marked for something great. Samson was an impulsive man, and his strength was not enough to protect him from his own weaknesses. He had an impetuous nature, often acting without thinking about the consequences, guided more by impulse than by wisdom or self-control. This often led him into complicated situations. He was constantly in a struggle, not only against his enemies, but also against his own desires and passions. He knew his strength, but he didn't fully understand his mission. He felt invincible, believing his physical strength was the key to everything. And indeed, his victories over the Philistines were impressive. But there was a growing tension within him, a struggle between his divine mission and his own impulses, something that would put him at risk at crucial moments. Samson not only grew in strength, but also in wisdom, or at least, that's what he believed. His talent for battle and his ability to defeat the enemies of Israel made him a central figure among his people. However, time and experience had not been enough to mature what was inside him, an overconfidence in himself. He felt that there was nothing he couldn't do. This confidence, though understandable given his power, would become his greatest weakness. And it was in this moment of self-sufficiency that Samson made one of the gravest mistakes of his life. He believed that his strength was his own, something he could control and use to his advantage. However, Samson's true strength did not come from his ability to fight or his immense muscles, but from his relationship with God. His real strength was spiritual, and he should never have strayed from that. This period of growth and display of power was, paradoxically, a time of inner fragility for Samson. While the people of Israel saw him as a hero, he himself was becoming increasingly blind to the true meaning of his strength. He was becoming a man of extraordinary deeds, but at the same time, he was losing sight of his divine mission. Each victory made him feel more invulnerable, and he seemed to forget that it was God who sustained him, not his own strength. The strongest man in Israel was, in reality, on a path where his greatest battle would be against himself. It was only a matter of time before Samson would have to face the consequences of this overconfidence, and the line between glory and downfall would begin to narrow as his story unfolded. The wind of destiny blew into Samson's life when he, at the peak of his strength and confidence, did something unexpected. Despite being an Israelite, he fell in love with a Philistine woman. This love seemed unusual, even inappropriate, given the history of hostility between the Israelites and the Philistines. The Israelites had always been oppressed by this warrior people, and the idea of marrying a Philistine woman was far from a choice approved by his family or community. But Samson was not moved by logic or the advice of others. He wanted that woman. She, to him, was an irresistible passion. The intensity with which he wanted to marry the Philistine woman became clear when, without hesitation, he asked his parents to arrange the wedding. Even with the warnings from Manoah and his wife, who knew the importance of remaining faithful to Israel's traditions, Samson did not relent. He insisted that she was the woman he had fallen in love with, and nothing else mattered. For him, that desire was everything. Love, or rather obsession, seemed to be stronger than anything else, even stronger than the principles he had been taught since birth. But behind his desire, something much greater was being orchestrated. God, with his infinite wisdom, was already beginning to use Samson's choices for a larger purpose. While his parents were aware of the implications of his request, Samson's insistence was not accidental. The Lord himself was guiding this desire in a mysterious way, because, as he knew, a confrontation was inevitable, a clash between the people of Israel and the Philistines, something that would force the fulfillment of the prophecy of deliverance. By seeking this marriage, Samson was setting the stage for conflict. This act seemed like a personal decision, but in reality, it was aligned with God's plans. It was the necessary catalyst for Samson to begin his journey of confrontations with the Philistines. This seemingly trivial relationship would open doors for a series of events that would lead to Israel's liberation. However, Samson's actions did not go unnoticed. His parents, distressed, tried to dissuade him, worried that he was going against the expectations of his people and his faith. But Samson was resolute. He was blindly in love, or perhaps deluded by the idea that the desire of his heart should be what guided his choices. His love for this Philistine woman had become an obsession, a force that would lead him further away from his true calling. He didn't understand, but what seemed like a personal life choice would prove to be the key to a divine confrontation that would shape his destiny and that of Israel. The wedding proposal was the first step of a long series of choices that would define his life, a mix of divine faith and human desire, where God's plan would intertwine with Samson's own mistakes and failures. And although he didn't know it at that moment, this decision would begin to show him that, even in moments of apparent disobedience, God's hand was silently working in his favor, preparing him for the great mission that was to come. The day of Samson's journey to the city, where his wedding to the Philistine woman would take place, finally arrived. With his impetuous spirit and unbeatable confidence, he left without hesitation. He did not know that this would be the first of many challenges that would bring him face to face with the true nature of his strength and his mission. What should have been a simple trip turned into an event that would mark his life forever. As he walked along the desolate road, Samson was startled by a thunderous roar. Before he could understand what was happening, a fierce lion appeared, attacking him with savagery. His eyes flashed with rage, and without thinking twice, he reacted. What happened next was something impossible to explain by any human strength. With a swift and precise strike, Samson tore the lion to pieces with his bare hands. An ordinary human would never have been able to accomplish such a feat, but Samson was no ordinary man. The supernatural strength that accompanied him made him defeat the lion with a shocking ease. After defeating the animal, Samson didn't celebrate as if it were a simple victory. He just looked at the dead lion, perhaps not yet realizing how much that represented. The act seemed so natural, so integrated into his existence, that he simply continued on his way, not revealing his feat to anyone. But at that moment, the Spirit of the Lord had manifested in such a clear and powerful way that it would leave an indelible mark on his life. This encounter with the lion was not just a demonstration of physical strength. It was in fact a sign, a divine reminder that Samson was being empowered by a force that transcended any human power. He possessed something beyond what he could understand or control. His strength was not his own, and that lion, fierce and unbeatable for any other man, had become a mere puppet in the face of God's power. But even with this clear reminder of God's presence in his life, Samson did not stop to reflect deeply on what had just happened. He was above all an impulsive man, and his journey was just beginning. Later, as he passed by the same path, Samson came across the carcass of the lion again. To his surprise, something very curious was happening. Inside the lion's carcass, a swarm of bees had formed, producing honey. Without thinking about the implications, Samson took some of the honey and ate it. What seemed like a simple discovery ended up violating one of the most fundamental principles of his Nazirite vow: touching something impure, something that was considered sacrilege. The encounter with the lion, then, not only revealed the supernatural strength Samson possessed, but also began to show the contradictions that would define him. A man chosen by God, with a divine purpose, but one who often chose to ignore his consecration. Samson's true battle was not just against the Philistines or the enemies of Israel, but against the temptations he placed in his own path. And that lion, which he had defeated with such power, had become a symbol of the internal struggle he still did not fully understand. With the lion defeated and honey found inside its body, Samson barely knew that this simple moment of curiosity would become the starting point for a series of events that would only increase the tension with the Philistines. After eating the honey, Samson, always unpredictable, decided to use his discovery in an audacious way. During the celebration of his wedding, surrounded by Philistine friends, he challenged them to solve a riddle that seemed simple but actually hid a deep secret. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet, he declared, leaving everyone puzzled. The Philistines, unaware of the connection with the lion and the honey inside its body, were baffled, trying to solve the riddle. But it was impossible for them to understand the true answer. They didn't know that Samson, in his journey, had found the honey inside the lion's carcass, a detail he kept to himself. The riddle seemed harmless, but it was in fact a provocation, a game of intelligence and cunning. For the Philistines, it seemed like a simple challenge. But for Samson, it was a way to mock the enemies surrounding him and test his own ability to manipulate a situation. As time passed, and the Philistines struggled to solve the riddle, Samson knew he was beginning to sow a little discord among his guests. For them, the riddle represented a game of honor. For him, it was a strategic move, one step closer to the final clash he knew he would have with this oppressive people. But what Samson didn't yet realize was how much pride and stubbornness were beginning to dictate his actions. He wanted to win, yes, but something inside him, perhaps a sense of revenge for everything his people had suffered, was fueling his impulsive approach. The Philistines, in their desperation, were forced to turn to Samson's wife. She, pressured by the promise of rewards, gave in to the temptation to manipulate her husband. She approached Samson, used her charm and tears, asking him to reveal the secret of the riddle to save the honor of the Philistines. Samson's internal moral conflict grew. He knew he was being manipulated, but once again, his impulsivity and the desire to please his wife led him to give in. With a sigh, he revealed the secret, the honey and the lion, and by doing so, gave them the key to solving the riddle. When the Philistines solved the riddle, Samson found himself betrayed, not only by his wife but by the idea that the honesty he thought he had built with her was, in reality, a game. She had manipulated him, not out of love, but out of greed and pressure. The trust he had in her crumbled, and with it, the basic principle that guided his decisions, trust in the people around him. This led to an explosion of rage, and he acted without thinking of the consequences. The riddle, which had started as a playful game, ended in an escalation of conflict, and without hesitation, Samson did what seemed to be his only option: revenge. This would lead him down a path of destruction and vengeance, but also make him begin to understand that, no matter how strong he was, the true battle was being fought inside him. The revelation of the riddle brought with it an unbearable weight for Samson. When he discovered that his wife, under pressure from the Philistines, had betrayed him, the anger building in his chest overflowed in a devastating way. He had trusted her, believed in her loyalty, and as always, things didn't go as he expected. However, the hatred that formed in his heart wasn't just for the deception of his wife, but because he had been manipulated and humiliated in front of the Philistines. It was as if all his strength and superiority had been challenged, and he didn't know how to deal with it other than with violence. Without thinking of the consequences, Samson decided to act. He was no longer the man who only sought revenge on his enemies. He had become someone driven by fury, willing to do anything to avenge the betrayal. The price he would demand for the 30 Philistines who solved the riddle fraudulently would be high, very high. With blazing fury, Samson went after the Philistines. He found the first 30 men he could, and with almost supernatural rage, killed them, one by one. He stripped them of their clothes, making them pay for the mistake that, in his mind, had led to his humiliation. In doing so, Samson not only vented his anger, but also made it clear that he would not allow himself to be dishonored or challenged without consequences. However, Samson's revenge did not stop with those 30 men. He knew that by provoking this kind of confrontation, a spiral of violence would be triggered, and this would only plunge him deeper into his own anger. But at that moment, reason seemed distant, and the only thing he could perceive was the need to exact the price for the damage to his honor. He no longer saw the bigger picture, just the flame of vengeance consuming his spirit. Samson returned to his home, but surprise awaited him. When he found out that his wife had been given to another man, his heart broke once more. The feeling of loss and betrayal was even crueler because he realized that the woman he had cared for so much had been taken by another, and everything he had done was in vain. The rage and disgust mixed in his chest, and he felt that, now more than ever, he was alone. The pain of betrayal drove him to a new act of vengeance, and without hesitation, he swore to make the Philistines pay for everything he had lost. Samson's fury reached colossal proportions, and he saw no other path than to destroy everything the Philistines valued most. He knew that by doing this, he would not recover what he had lost, but he had an insatiable need to regain control of the situation. Every action he took now was driven by pain, loss, and rage. He was at war with himself, and the Philistines became merely the victims of his emotional explosion. In his mind, justice still existed, but the way he sought to achieve that justice was making him increasingly distant from his true purpose. And while his physical strength was never questioned, his true battle had only just begun. With his heart full of rage and the pain of betrayal still fresh in his soul, Samson knew that the only way to make the Philistines feel the weight of their actions was to strike a blow they could not ignore. But he would not settle for simply attacking directly. He wanted something that would hit them at their core, something that would make them feel the power of vengeance he carried with him in their own land. So, it was with an audacious idea that Samson, in a fit of fury, captured 300 foxes. He tied torches to their tails and released them across the fields of the Philistines. The foxes, driven by panic and fire, ran back and forth, spreading destruction wherever they went. The fire consumed everything it touched, the crops, the vineyards, and even the wheat fields, sources of life and sustenance for the Philistines. It was a revenge not only physical, but psychological. The Philistines, who had been the oppressors, now saw their wealth, their means of survival being consumed by flames. For Samson, it was a reflection of the inner fire he felt. He wanted to see the Philistines burn with fear and pain, just as he was burning with rage. Each fox running through those fields was like an echo of Samson's fury, a silent scream leading to destruction. The impact of this act was devastating. When the Philistines saw their crops reduced to ashes, despair took hold of them. But at the same time, fear grew. Who is this man, so relentless and full of power, capable of causing such destruction with a simple move? The flames that consumed the land also began to consume the pride of the Philistines, and fear spread like wildfire through the dry forests. However, this action did not come without its consequences. The Philistines, in their rage, demanded retaliation. They couldn't let Samson act with such impunity. It was a matter of honor for them. And so, the spiral of revenge began to spiral with more force. But for Samson, the flames of the fields burned deeper than just fire. They reflected the fire of his own heart, the flame of a man who saw himself trapped by anger and pain. Though he inflicted great suffering upon his enemies, Samson couldn't escape the fact that he was sinking deeper into an endless cycle of violence. What he saw as justice was turning into a vicious spiral that more and more took him further from his original purpose. And as the flames died down, Samson found himself more alone, more consumed by his own rage. The fire in the Philistines' fields had caused immense chaos, but what would follow would be even more devastating. The Philistines' anger couldn't be contained, and in response to the destruction of their land, they made a ruthless decision: revenge. Samson had not only undone the livelihood of a powerful people, but had also humiliated their strength. And for the Philistines, this humiliation demanded a heavy price. Their response was brutal and personal. They killed Samson's wife and father-in-law, making the blow even more painful and irreversible. When Samson learned of his wife's death, it was more than just a loss, it was the breaking point. He felt that everything he had done up to that point, all the battles and victories, meant nothing if his personal pain wasn't avenged. The anger, which had once been under control, now consumed him entirely. The man who had once been guided by a divine mission was now transformed into someone driven only by the desire for revenge, and he knew that he would have to pay a high price for it. Samson didn't hesitate. He launched a relentless attack on the Philistines, and in his fury, he killed many of them. With each strike, with each life taken, he felt that he was not only avenging the loss of his beloved, but also freeing himself from the weight of guilt and frustration that was eating him up. He thought of nothing but the need to see the Philistines suffer as he was suffering. The massacre he caused was immense, and the land was covered in blood. Samson then once again proved that his strength was not just physical, but also fueled by an insatiable desire for retribution. But after the attack, a sense of emptiness overcame Samson. He had hurt the Philistines, but what had he gained? His wife was dead, and he was further than ever from understanding the true meaning of his mission. Samson couldn't escape the feeling that, with each act of violence, he was moving further away from the purpose God had for him. With nothing left to tie him there, Samson withdrew, but not to find peace. He fled to a cave, not to hide from the Philistines, but to hide from himself. He was exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually, and he knew that if he wanted to continue, he would have to confront his own demons. However, what he didn't know was that Samson's true battle was no longer with the Philistines, but with his own nature, with the anger that consumed him. And there, in that cave, he took refuge from everything. But at the same time, he was drifting further and further from his true mission. As Samson hid in the cave, isolated and consumed by his own anguish, a new threat emerged. The Philistines, who had been humiliated and threatened by his strength, were now determined to eliminate once and for all the man who caused them so much fear. But Samson didn't know that, by trying to distance himself from his responsibility, he would eventually become a target even of the Israelites, his own people. Fearful of retaliation from the Philistines, the Israelites, feeling pressured and vulnerable, decided that the best way to deal with Samson was to hand him over to the Philistines. Without question, without trying to understand the greatness of the man God had chosen to deliver them, they betrayed him. Armed with ropes, the men of Judah went to the cave where Samson was hiding, ready to bind him and deliver him to the enemy. Samson, however, was no ordinary man, and even in his isolation, the Spirit of the Lord was still with him. When the Israelites arrived and bound him, thinking he wouldn't have the strength to break free, he didn't hesitate. In a display of strength that seemed impossible, he tore the ropes apart as if they were mere strands of straw. With the Spirit of God moving upon him, Samson felt his strength increase once more, as if the anger and pain he felt were turning into pure divine energy. Then, with impressive speed, he grabbed a donkey's jawbone, a simple and unexpected object, but in his hands, it became a lethal weapon. Samson, now immersed in his divine fury, faced the Philistines who were about to capture him. With the jawbone, he struck quickly and relentlessly, each blow stronger than the last. The Philistines fell one after another, unable to defend against this man who seemed invincible. The battle that followed was a spectacle of strength and endurance. Samson, with his supernatural strength, killed 1,000 men with a simple donkey's jawbone, without needing any other weapon. He proved that, even without his sword or any military resources, his strength came directly from God and was more powerful than any army. Each blow he struck was a reflection of divine power in action, and the Philistines, despite their numerical superiority, found themselves powerless against him. However, after the massacre, Samson was exhausted, more than any previous battle. His physical strength was no longer enough to continue. He felt the weight of the battle, not just in his body, but in his soul. And it was in this moment of weakness, when he was about to succumb, that he looked to the sky once more and, in a cry of desperation, cried out to God for water, for his throat was dry and his body almost drained of strength. That moment of vulnerability was crucial. Samson, who had until then relied on his own strength, now recognized that his true strength came from God. And in response to his cry, God made a spring of water flow, and Samson, relieved, refreshed himself, knowing that his survival was in the Lord's hands. But Samson's internal battle was far from over. He still had to face his own flaws and find, once again, his way to fulfill the purpose God had for him. After the fight with the 1,000 Philistines, Samson was in a state of complete exhaustion. His body, marked by battle and tension, could no longer go on, and he was about to succumb to fatigue. The sight of spilled blood and fallen bodies around him was still fresh in his mind, but his body had no more strength to stay on its feet. The dryness in his throat was becoming unbearable. Without water, he was about to lose consciousness, and it seemed nothing could save this tireless hero. But at that moment of vulnerability, something unexpected happened. Samson, usually impulsive and acting on his own, did something he may have never done with such humility. He called out to God. Without reservations, he asked the Lord for help, acknowledging that his strength did not come from his ability to fight, but from divine providence. He knew that, without God's help, he wouldn't survive to continue the mission given to him. And it was at that moment, when Samson was on the brink of collapsing, that God heard his prayer. God, in his infinite mercy, caused a spring of water to flow from a dry rock. The water appeared miraculously, a direct answer to Samson's cry. He approached the spring and drank, relieving his thirst, feeling the refreshing water fill his body and soul. The water not only revived his physical body, but also brought spiritual renewal, reminding him that he was not alone in his struggle. This miracle was not just a physical blessing, but also a profound lesson for Samson. Throughout his life, he had relied on his strength and his anger to fight his enemies. But in that moment of weakness, he realized that his true strength had always come from God. The power he possessed wasn't something that could be manipulated or used selfishly, but a divine grace that needed to be recognized and depended upon. Samson, now rejuvenated, realized that his mission was not over. He He still had much to do to free his people from the oppression of the Philistines, but he needed to remember his true source of strength. The water that God had provided for him became a symbol of his renewal and the constant presence of the Lord in his life. Reinvigorated and with a renewed spirit, Samson prepared to face the challenges that still lay ahead, now more aware of his dependence on God to fulfill the purpose for which he had been chosen. After the resounding victory over the 1,000 Philistines, Samson found himself at a moment of transition. Although he had once again proven that divine strength was with him, he could not ignore the reality of his own humanity. For 20 long years, he ruled Israel, but his leadership was marked by a constant struggle between his supernatural strength and his own impulses. His reign was not simple, but he kept the Philistines under control and ensured that the people of Israel had some relief during this dark period. But ruling was not easy for Samson. Although he was a feared and respected leader, he still struggled with his inner weaknesses. His temper and the impulsiveness that had led him to so many battles and tragedies were still present, like an uncontrollable fire. Despite his victories, he could not fully master his own instincts. He felt torn between the divine mission that God had given him and the desire to follow his own impulses, which led him to make repeated mistakes. The Philistines, though still fearful, did not give up. They continued trying to find ways to weaken Samson, but he remained strong and firm in his convictions. During this period of leadership, he not only defeated the Philistines in battles, but also used his strength to protect the borders of Israel. With each victory, Samson renewed the hope of the people of Israel. But despite his accomplishments, he could never fully become the man that God had called him to be. As he governed, Samson also began to reflect on his life and his role as a leader. He constantly remembered the promise that God had made to his parents about his mission. He knew that he could not continue depending on his physical strength or his impulsive actions. His true mission was to serve God with a humble and obedient heart. But with each victory, it seemed like he drifted a little further from the true essence of his calling. The 20-year period was not only one of achievements, but also of internal struggles. Samson battled against pride, against the sense of invincibility that his victories gave him, and against the need to do everything his own way. He had the power to change the fate of Israel, but he could not always control his impulsive nature. However, God's hand was still upon him, and that was enough to keep the Philistines at bay, at least for now. Although he was a strong and capable leader, Samson knew that his true strength was not in his ability to govern with a firm hand, but in his capacity to surrender to God's will. And with that, he began to understand that, in order to fulfill his destiny, he would need more than physical strength or courage. He would need the wisdom to make the right choices and a heart willing to follow the divine will, even when it meant sacrificing his own desires. After 20 years of leadership and victories over the Philistines, Samson continued to be an imposing and fearless figure, but with the weight of his own failures still hanging over him. His enemies were always waiting for a crack, an opportunity to weaken him. And when Samson made his way to Gaza, a fortified city of the Philistines, he had no idea what awaited him. That night, as he walked through the streets of Gaza, the Philistines, aware of his presence, began to stir. Gaza was surrounded by towering walls and iron gates, and the Philistines thought they had finally cornered him. They knew that Samson felt invincible and that his strength was a mystery. So, an opportunity seemed to finally present itself, a chance to capture him once and for all. The Philistines, planning to ambush him, waited the entire night in silence, certain that the hero of Israel would have nowhere to escape. But Samson, as always, had something different in mind. He feared neither the city walls nor the plans of the Philistines. And that night, something within him awakened. Feeling challenged, he decided to show everyone that, as long as his strength was with him, nothing could truly stop him. When the Philistines finally prepared to surround him, Samson, in an act of pure boldness, headed for the city gates. The giant gates of Gaza were the last line of defense, but Samson did not hesitate. Using all the strength that the Spirit of God had granted him, he tore the iron gates from their hinges, including the columns that held them. With terrifying ease, he lifted them onto his shoulders as if they were made of straw and carried them with relentless determination. The city of Gaza, now completely defenseless, watched in disbelief as Samson, with the gates on his shoulders, walked away. He made his way to the top of a hill and there simply threw them down, making it clear to all that he was not bound by physical limitations or the strategies of the Philistines. He was more than a man. He was an instrument of divine strength, and nothing could contain him. The Philistines were terrified, not only by the loss of the gates, but by the power that Samson had once again demonstrated. It was not just his physical strength that impressed them, but the audacity and confidence he had, knowing that his God would always protect him and empower him. This boldness was a symbolic blow to the Philistines, showing them that, no matter how strong their cities or weapons were, they would never have control over God's plan for Israel. For Samson, carrying the gates of Gaza was not just a display of strength. It was a reminder of his mission, and that he did not need to hide in the shadows or fear the Philistines. He was being guided by something far greater than his own will. The victory at Gaza, like all the other victories he had achieved, was a reflection of God's strength working through him. He was not invincible on his own, but through what God did through him. And at that moment, the city of Gaza and all the Philistines around it had a clear understanding of this. In time, Samson's life took an unexpected turn. His audacity and unbeatable strength, which had been symbols of his divine mission, began to be overshadowed by his vulnerability. He, the man chosen by God, with supernatural strength, finally met someone who would challenge him in a way he had never imagined. Delilah, a Philistine woman, appeared in his life, and for a time, he allowed himself to become involved with her. Delilah, seductive and cunning, seemed to be the perfect woman. But what Samson didn't know was that she was being manipulated by the Philistines. They, in their relentless pursuit to defeat him, saw in her the key to finally putting an end to Samson's power. And so, they bribed Delilah with a promise of great wealth in exchange for the revelation of the secret behind Samson's unmatched strength. What seemed to be a genuine relationship between them quickly turned into a dangerous trap. Delilah, with her persuasive skills, began to question Samson about the source of his strength. Initially, Samson played along, telling her lies about how he could be defeated, but Delilah, in her thirst for reward, pressed him repeatedly. She pushed him day after day, with tears and pleas, until finally, Samson, tired and vulnerable, revealed his secret. He told Delilah that his strength came from his hair, a visible sign of his consecration to God. If it were cut, he would lose his power. This was the secret he had kept for so long, and now, in a moment of emotional weakness, he gave it up. Delilah, with a victorious smile, went to the Philistines, who were eagerly waiting to capture Samson. In the dead of night, while he slept in her arms, Delilah cut his long hair, a simple act that meant the loss of his divine strength. When Samson woke up, he didn't realize what had happened. He got up as usual, ready to face any threat. But when he tried to fight the Philistines, he realized, terrified, that his strength was gone. The Philistines, now sure of his defeat, stormed into the room, captured Samson, and humiliated him before everyone. He was bound, taken to the city of Gaza, and as if he were just another prisoner, his eyes were gouged out. Samson, the man who had once defied the forces of an entire nation, was now captive, reduced to a slave, blind and powerless. This betrayal by Delilah marked a turning point in Samson's life. He had trusted her, and she betrayed him. The loss of his hair was not only physical, but also spiritual. He found himself completely dependent on his own strength, and when that strength failed, the reality of his vulnerability came to light. But even in the midst of this humiliation, something still burned in his heart. He knew his life story had not ended there. But what he didn't know was that, though his eyes were blind, he would begin to see more clearly than ever. Samson was captured, but his greatest defeat was just beginning. The Philistines, fueled by revenge, were not content with simply imprisoning him. They wanted to destroy his image, humiliate him in a way that he could never regain his strength, both physically and spiritually. After being captured, Samson was dragged with chains and shackles through the streets of Gaza, where the Philistine people celebrated the capture of the man who had terrorized their people so many times. He, who had once been a symbol of unshakable power, was now completely submissive, bound, weak, blind, and lost in his own reality. The Philistines, in a cruel act of revenge, blinded Samson by gouging out his eyes. The physical pain was unbearable, but the most painful blow was what happened inside him. He, who had once been so proud of his strength, now found himself in total disgrace. In the darkness, in the silence of his own pain, Samson was thrown into prison, where he was forced to grind grain, a humiliating task for a man who had once been feared by all. However, it was in this place of physical and emotional darkness that something began to happen. Samson began to reflect. Far from his grand deeds and strength, he finally confronted his true weakness. arrogance, disobedience, overconfidence in himself. He had forgotten where his true strength came from, relying on his own power instead of on God. For days, he felt the weight of his blindness, not just in his eyes, but in his soul. He felt desolate, humiliated, but somehow reconciled with his weakness. He was no longer the indestructible hero he had believed himself to be. Yet, it was in this place of total impotence that Samson began to feel that there was still something more inside him. Something more than just physical strength. Something he could still access, despite his defeat. Samson's prison, paradoxically, became the field where his true transformation began. He was blind to the eyes of others, but his spirit began to be illuminated in a way he had never imagined before. Samson, by losing everything, was finally preparing to be the man he should have always been. Someone who did not depend on his own strength, but on God. He didn't know it, but the best was yet to come. Time passed in the dungeons of Gaza. Samson's days were long and silent, marked only by the sound of his chains and the hard labor of grinding grain. His hair, once a symbol of divine strength, had grown back, but he was still blind and humiliated, unsure if he would ever return to the greatness he once had. However, the experience of being reduced to nothing began to change something within him. In his prison, Samson found himself constantly praying, meditating on his life and his mistakes. He remembered the promises made to his parents, the words of the angel, the victories achieved by the strength that came from God, and the lessons he had ignored. In the midst of pain, he began to feel the flame of faith reignite in his heart. His self-reliance, which had led to his downfall, was replaced by a new understanding of his true strength, the strength that came from God's grace and mercy. As his hair grew, Samson experienced a kind of spiritual rebirth. He felt an inner renewal, as if his connection with God was being restored, little by little, along with the growth of his hair. This wasn't just the physical growth of his hair, but a metaphor for his spiritual regeneration, a clear sign that he was still chosen, that God had not abandoned him, and that, in his grace, Samson still had a role to play. This renewal was not only emotional, but also spiritual. The Samson of before, who acted on impulse, vanity, and anger, began to dissolve, giving way to a more humble man, more aware of his human fragility and his total dependence on God. His heart, once inflamed by arrogance, was now more open to God's will. And as his hair grew, a new strength, more subtle and profound, began to form within him. Samson knew that his mission was not over. He, who had been forced to face his own mortality, was now ready for the last chapter of his story, an act of faith and sacrifice that would not only destroy his enemies, but also restore his true connection with God, proving that even in moments of greatest weakness, God's strength can manifest in extraordinary ways. Samson was ready for the final stage of his journey, not as a strong man, but as a man with renewed faith. He knew that destiny still had something great in store for him, and the growth of his hair was only the beginning of this journey of redemption. The air was heavy in the prison of Gaza, and the echo of Samson's footsteps reverberated through the stone walls. He felt the weight of his own existence. The man who had once brought down lions and destroyed cities was now captive, without honor, without vision. His days were immersed in darkness, and his only companion was the silence of his soul, reflecting on the mistakes he had made. But in the midst of his solitude, something deeper was happening within him. Samson felt that his mission had not ended. He knew that his mistakes had cost him dearly, but he also believed that God had not abandoned him, that there was still something more to be done, something great to be achieved. His faith, restored in the depths of his prison, now propelled him with renewed inner strength. One morning, the Philistines organized a great celebration in honor of their victory over the great enemy of Israel. The temple of Dagon, the Philistine god, was filled with cheers and laughter as the princes and great leaders of the people gathered for a joyful feast. Samson was brought before the large crowd, a public humiliation, where they displayed him as a trophy of their supremacy over Israel. He, blind and weak, was placed between two massive pillars that supported the temple. At this moment of humiliation, something ignited within Samson. He knew that this was his last opportunity. He had nothing left to lose. The man who had once fought for freedom, who had rebelled against God's plans, now surrendered to God's will, with a heart full of repentance and faith. Without eyes to see, but with his spiritual clarity restored, he made one last request to God. With a hoarse voice full of faith, he cried out to the Lord, "O Lord God, remember me. Strengthen me, O God, just this once more, so that I, with one blow, may take revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Samson was not asking for vengeance for his own honor or glory, but to fulfill the divine purpose that was still in his life. He knew that this act wasn't just an act of revenge, but a final chance to glorify God, to fulfill his mission of freeing Israel. And in that moment, a supernatural strength took hold of him, different from all the ones he had experienced before. His faith, humility, and repentance were the keys that unlocked an even greater strength than any of his past feats. God, in his mercy, heard his prayer and granted him the strength to do what seemed impossible. Samson, with his hands firmly planted on the columns, felt God's power pouring over him once more. He was ready to take the final and most glorious step of his journey. He was no longer seeking fame or recognition, but the honor of God, and he knew that, in the end, his true strength came only from him. The great Philistine celebration continued, founded in ignorance and arrogance. The leaders of the people were absorbed in their false sense of security, celebrating what they believed to be the final defeat of their greatest enemy, Samson. The temple of Dagon, vast and ornate, echoed with laughter and applause as the Philistines mocked the man who had once terrified them, now reduced to nothing more than a curiosity to entertain their party. But while the crowd laughed and partied, Samson was in a completely different state. He was no longer the impetuous man, full of pride and self-sufficiency. His humility was deep, and his faith in God had become unshakable. He felt the weight of the columns in his hands, the massive structure of the temple threatening to collapse at any moment. The weight he felt on his shoulders wasn't just physical, but spiritual. He was about to do something that would not only destroy his enemies, but would free the people of Israel and restore God's honor. With the palms of his hands firmly pressed against the columns holding up the temple, Samson prayed one last time. "O Lord God, remember me. Strengthen me, O God, just once more, so that I may avenge the Philistines for what they have done to me." He knew this would be the final moment of his life, but also the last opportunity to fulfill the divine calling that had always been upon him. With superhuman effort, driven not by the strength of his own muscles, but by the divine energy descending upon him, Samson pushed the columns. The ground trembled, and with a deafening crash, the columns began to give way, and the entire temple began to collapse. The destruction was catastrophic. The stone building, which had seemed unshakable, collapsed, crushing the Philistines and all those who had rejoiced in what they believed to be a victory they had achieved. The celebration turned into utter chaos. Samson, with all his strength gathered for the last time, didn't care about his imminent death. He was conscious that this sacrifice was necessary, that his life had a purpose that was now being fulfilled. The destruction wasn't just physical, but a definitive blow to the heart of Philistine power. Samson, in his final act, destroyed the symbol of oppression that had subjugated Israel for so long. He fell with the temple, but with his faith restored and his purpose fulfilled. The Lord used him until the end, turning what seemed to be his demise into a great victory for the people of Israel. Samson died at the moment when he needed God the most, and by giving up his life, he made it so that Israel was freed from the yoke of the Philistines, bringing a victory that no human force could have achieved. The destruction of the temple marked the end of an era of oppression and, at the same time, the fulfillment of a divine plan that transcended the flaws and weaknesses of a man. Samson's name, now not as a symbol of strength, but as an example of restored faith, would continue to resonate through the generations. He died without the glory of a king, but with the glory of someone who fulfilled the divine purpose, and his last act was an expression of total surrender and dependence on God. Samson's body was buried in a simple grave, not with the honors of a hero, but with the remembrance of a man who, though marked by failures and mistakes, was also an instrument in God's hands. His death was both tragic and triumphant. At the end of his journey, he wasn't remembered as the invincible man who tore apart lions or brought down armies with his hands, but as an example of how God can use even moments of human weakness to fulfill his greatest purposes. His story is not just about physical strength or the number of Philistines killed. The true lesson of Samson is found in his ability, even at his lowest points, to recognize the sovereignty of God. What he learned at the end of his life was that true strength doesn't come from grand deeds or personal victories, but from total dependence on God. Throughout his journey, Samson relied more on his physical strength than on the strength of his faith. His impulsiveness and pride led him to make mistakes that came at a great cost. But what he discovered at the end of it all was that God doesn't abandon his chosen ones, even when they fall from grace. His restoration didn't come from his own actions, but from divine grace. When Samson finally turned to God, it was in that surrender that he found true strength. This final act of destroying the Philistine temple, dying with his enemies, was the symbol of his complete surrender. He didn't die for personal vengeance, but to fulfill God's will. In his last prayer, he asked God for renewed strength, and that strength wasn't given to satisfy his ego, but to free an oppressed people. The final lesson his story offers is that, even in our greatest mistakes and failures, there is always an opportunity for redemption. God can bring good out of evil, transform weakness into strength, and use our flaws to accomplish great deeds. Samson teaches us that true power comes from recognizing our dependence on God, and that the strength he gives us is not for our own benefit, but for the fulfillment of his divine purpose. Therefore, the story of Samson is a reminder that no matter how far we've gone in our failures, or how powerless we feel, God can restore us. Samson's final sacrifice, a man who finally recognized what truly matters, serves as a beacon of hope for all of us. He wasn't perfect, but his life and death taught the people of Israel, and us, an eternal lesson about the power of faith, the mercy of God, and the true strength that comes from trusting in him. And so we conclude the story of Samson, a man whose life teaches us that true strength comes from our faith and dependence on God, even in our weakest moments. If you enjoyed this incredible journey and the lessons we can learn from it, don't forget to leave a like. It helps a lot to spread these inspiring stories. Comment below with your thoughts on this story and which part impacted you the most. I'd love to hear your opinion and exchange ideas with you. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do so now to make sure you don't miss any fascinating content like this. Also, click the bell to be notified whenever we publish new videos about Bible stories, historical curiosities, and much more. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.